Okay, so we're talking about Rehoboam. Rehoboam was Solomon's son. And let me say this at the outset. When I was a kid, it was hard for me to remember, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, who went with who. You had Jeroboam and Rehoboam, you have Israel, the northern 10 tribes, right, and Judah, the southern 2 tribes. And I would get confused. So somebody gave me a trick, and I taught that trick to Erica. Erica, are you here? No, oh, she's in the back. So she would tell you, I hope she remembers what it was, but the J's don't go together, right? So when you're trying to think of who goes with who, Jeroboam, Rehoboam, Judah, and Israel, the J's don't go together. So Jeroboam does not go with Judah. Jeroboam goes with Israel, and that leaves Rehoboam for the southern 2 tribes. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. He reigned 17 years. This is a little background information. He was 41 when he started to reign. He reigned from 976 BC to 959 BC is when his reign was. Now, if I were to ask you, and we're going to talk about this, so we don't have to get into it with much detail right now, but if I was to ask you, what's the thing that stands out to you about Rehoboam? What's his big mistake that we always call to memory about Rehoboam? Yes, ma'am.
He didn't listen to the advice of the older people, but kind of went with what the younger people were telling him.
Went with the counselors, the younger counselors. We are going to talk about that later. That's exactly right. That's what we always talk about, and we talk about that as a result of that, the kingdom split. We've got the northern 10 tribes, we've got the southern 2 tribes, but I'm going to challenge our thinking on that a little bit today, and let's start out with the slide that we finished with last week. Remember, these are some of the consequences of Solomon's mistakes. And when we did talk about this last week, but I want to reiterate it as we enter into the study of Rehoboam. Let's read 1 Kings 11, 9 through 13. 1 Kings 11, 9 through 13. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord and the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my commandment and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Remember, Jeroboam is a servant? Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Okay, couple of things about this. Number one, remember, when we're thinking about the whys, why did God do this? Why is the kingdom divided? He tells Solomon, it's because you didn't follow my commandments. So I think sometimes we think about Rehoboam over here as he's the reason. But maybe God would have intervened and not allowed the kingdom to split had Solomon remained faithful. Had Solomon remained faithful, maybe his son, Rehoboam, would have learned something by his father's faith. His father's faith, and not kind of gone the direction that he ultimately did. We don't know. But God told Solomon, it's because you didn't follow my commandments, I'm going to tear 10 of these tribes and give them to your servant in the days of your son. Now, I know the math doesn't add up. There's 12 tribes, and he says, I'm going to tear 10 of them away, and I'm going to leave one for your son. Why is that? Why is that? Does anybody have an opinion or thoughts on why frequently Judah and Benjamin, the southern 2 tribes, are just referred to as one tribe? Anybody have any thoughts? Did quite a bit of reading on this, and most of the scholars believe that by this time, Benjamin had pretty much been absorbed by Judah. Okay, Judah being the stronger tribe, Benjamin being down there. The borders of their territories both bordered Jerusalem itself, and Benjamin just had been absorbed by the more powerful, more populous tribe. That's not to say that there were no longer any Benjamites. I mean, think about the New Testament. Who's a notable Benjamite in the New Testament? One that comes to mind. Anyone? Paul. Paul is a Benjamite. So it's not that all the Benjamites went away and lost their identity like many of the northern tribes. The Benjamites still kept their identity, but frequently they're referred to, the southern kingdom is referred to as one tribe. Don't let that throw you. I mean, even check out just a little bit later than where we read 1 Kings 11, verses 30 through 32. This is more about Jeroboam, and we'll talk more about this next week. But just quickly note this. I mean, it's kind of funny because Ahijah tears up his robe into 12 pieces and uses this illustration, but the math just doesn't work, right? Verse 30 of the same chapter, then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. He said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, thus says the Lord God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from the other tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me, etc. It's just kind of funny that even in this very kind of visual illustration of tearing up his robe into 12 pieces, it says, and giving 10 of those to Jeroboam, he refers to the other two as one. And I think that's because, for the most part, Benjamin had been absorbed into Judah at this point. Yes, sir?
I don't want to make a bigger point of this than you want to, but what's happening with Levi? Are they still going to be in both? Are there going to be Levi's in the north and in the south?
That's a great question, Ryan. And within the context of the chapters that we're reading today, and I probably can't put my finger on it just as quickly as I would want to, but within the context of these chapters, it tells us that when the split happened and Rehoboam is ruling in Jerusalem, that the Levites who wanted to follow God, they went down to Jerusalem. And so remember, the tribe of Levi didn't get a land allotment. So when we talk about the 12 tribes, we're usually not talking about Levi. We still come up with 12 because the tribe of Joseph was divided into two, Manasseh and Ephraim. So we still come up with 12 land allotments, 12 tribes. But the Levites, the ones who wanted to follow God, came down to Jerusalem. And interestingly, the text also tells us that though there were people in the northern 10 tribes who worshiping God was also important to them, it says they followed the Levites down. And it says this strengthened Rehoboam. Rehoboam's position in Jerusalem with the southern two tribes, it became stronger because the Levites and people from the other 10 tribes who worshiping God was important to, they followed him down. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time and not get to any of the class material, but it is interesting. Frequently we refer to those northern 10 tribes, and you'll see it in the literature, as the quote-unquote lost tribes of Israel. Well, they were, when we come to the New Testament times, we talk about the Samaritans, and these were some of the remnants of the people of the northern 10 tribes who had intermarried under Assyrian captivity. They kind of lost their identity, but not all of them. Even the northern 10 tribes, not all of them. We see this, at least once comes to mind. I hope I can pull it out. Turn to Luke, the 2nd chapter, and now this will be my final word on this, Ryan. Luke, the 2nd chapter, and around about verse 36. Let's see if I'm right. And there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. So we don't get that very much in the New Testament. Somebody mentioned from the tribe other than Judah and Benjamin. So again, I wonder, and I see this, and I see Anna, and I wonder, was she a descendant of one of these people who followed the Levites back down to Jerusalem? It's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so note that verse 13 mentions one tribe being left alone. We talked about that. I need to check these off as I talk about them. In the New Testament, we use Israel as a proxy for talking about all 12 tribes. In the New Testament, we use Israel as a proxy for talking about God's people sometimes. Similarly, I think you can think of just the mention of the one tribe as a proxy for both Judah and Benjamin. Okay, I've got a long reading, 1 Kings 12, verses 1 through 20. This is probably the meat of some of what we're going to be talking about today. Can somebody read 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 20? It is a long reading. Yes, sir, David.
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him. Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Go away for 3 days, then come again to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" And they said to him, "If you will be a servant of this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him, and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father put on us'?" And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, "Thus shall you speak to this people who said to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you lightened it for us.' Thus you shall say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I'll add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king said, "Come to me again the third day." The king answered the people harshly, and forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David." So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, the tribe of Judah only.
Thank you. That is kind of a long reading. And that's what we remember about Rehoboam, right? We're going to talk more about some of the mistakes that he made here. But this is what we remember. Rehoboam, son of Solomon, son of the wisest man that ever lived. One of the first things we have recorded about him is he makes this very unwise decision to go with the counsel of the young men. The text tells us it's the men that he had grown up with. And I want you to think about that for just a minute. Before we do, while David was reading, I found the reference for you, Ryan. It's actually 2 Chronicles chapter 12. Look at verse 14. "For the Levites left their pasture lands, their property, and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had excluded them from serving as priests to the Lord. He, Jeroboam, set up priests of his own for the high places, for the satars, and for the calves which he had made. Those from the tribes of Israel who set their hearts on seeking the Lord God of Israel followed them into Jerusalem to sacrifice to the Lord God of their fathers. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, for 3 years." Okay, so it's over in 2 Chronicles. Just want to make sure I kind of found that for you. So what David just read is what we always remember about Rehoboam. And again, one of the things I want to challenge us to think about this morning is, can we really lay the whole separation of the united kingdom into the divided kingdom at the feet of Rehoboam? Because that's what we do. I mean, it's funny as you go out there and read a lot of the commentators and even members of the church who we've heard from, they refer to this incident as Rehoboam's folly, and and they'll say that the kingdom split because Rehoboam made this decision. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I just want to talk about that. I think it's my last slide that we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Now, before we finally leave Solomon, I brought this up last week, and I should have said this before David read, but before I change slides, let's just ask this question again. How could Solomon have made this mistake that ultimately led to the dividing of the kingdom? He was the wisest man that ever lived. Yeah, it's not going to happen until your son's reign, but it is going to happen during your son's reign. And what are the implications for me and you? Because I'm here to tell you, I'm no Solomon. I'm not the wisest guy that ever lived, all right? And we're always with accepting Jesus Christ in that. We know that he was God on earth. What do you think about that? How can the wisest man that ever lived allow himself to be drawn after foreign gods by his wives, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, sir.
I think a key to the answer to that question is in 1 Kings 11, verse 11, where
Good.
the Lord said to Solomon, I think this next part's the key. Since this has been your practice, he's been doing these things as a practice. It wasn't just a mistake or a couple of mistakes. It was a practice.
Yeah.
The way that he had been ruling. It was, maybe he was the wisest man, but he wasn't putting that part of it into practice. He was putting these bad things in practice.
That's really good. What translation is that? I'm just curious. Is that New King James? English Standard, ESV. I like that. This was something that he actively engaged in, is your point. It's not a mistake where he said, whoops, I need to repent. Remember when Nathan approached David and said, you're the man? What did David say? I've sinned. Okay, it wasn't like that. Solomon actively went after this, and it seems like he did for the majority of the last half of his reign. One of the verses I asked you to just look at and think about in relation to this question is Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1. Can somebody read Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1? Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1. Let me ask this. Does anybody have the Old King James? I really like the way it reads in the Old King James. I'm getting a lot of head shakes, no. There's probably not a lot of Old King James out there. Read it in whatever translation you have. Anybody?
Flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so little folly outweighs wisdom and honor.
Very good. Think about this. This is Ecclesiastes. Solomon wrote this. And what is the point that Solomon's trying to make in Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1? Dead flies make the perfumer's oil stink. I think the Old King James says something like, dead flies doth spoil the ointment of the apothecary. I just kind of like the way that rolls off the tongue. So what is Solomon trying to tell us? You could live your whole life building up a reputation of wisdom and honor, and you could mess it up with just a little bit of folly. That's what he's saying. You wonder if when Solomon wrote this, if he's thinking about himself. I think he probably is. Somebody asked me, do you think Solomon went to heaven? You know, I like to think, and Ryan and I were talking about the date of Ecclesiastes. I believe Ecclesiastes was written towards the end of Solomon's life. There are scholars out there that are revisionist scholars that think that Solomon didn't even write Ecclesiastes, that it was written between 300 and 500 BC. I'm not among them because they're scholars and I'm not. But I don't believe that. I think this was written towards the end of Solomon's life. I think there's too many things that point to a man reflecting on his life and his mistakes in the book of Ecclesiastes, and concludes, fear God and keep your commandments. But right here, think about how this specifically applies to Solomon's life. He had a lifetime of building up a reputation of wisdom. Remember what the Queen of Sheba said? She said, the half of it had not been told. And yet just a little bit of folly, this mistake of going after foreign wives and their gods. Now, every time we talk about Solomon, we got to talk about that too. What brought him down? I just think that's interesting. Okay, so, and it's because, again, I'm going to start off the discussion, it's because he did this that ultimately the kingdom was split. Okay, let's talk about a few of the things that Rehoboam did right. Now, granted, the list of the mistakes that Rehoboam made is going to be longer, and we're going to talk about, listening to the younger men instead of the older. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But the text is not without giving Rehoboam a few points of credit, mentioning a few things that he did right. Let's start with 2 Chronicles 11, verse 14. 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 14. Somebody go ahead and read that if you're over there. 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 14.
So the Levites left their common lands and their holdings and came to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons cast them out from serving as priests of the Lord.
Completely not the verse I was. I'm looking for. So they listened to the words of the Lord. Where did I miss that up? 12 and verse 1. Verse 4, thank you, of 12 and 4? 11 and 4. Oh, okay, I said 14, but it's verse 4. Thank you. Can you read that for me?
Yeah, man.
Thanks.
Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives. Return every man to his home, for this thing is for me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and returned and did not go against Jeroboam.
Okay. One of the things that Jeroboam did right in this instance was he listened when the man of God came to Rehoboam and said, thus says the Lord. Rehoboam listened. And, this is right after the split, right after the 10 tribes say, you know what, we want Jeroboam to be our king. You're going to be harsher than your dad. We could barely stand, the rule of your dad, and now you're going to make things worse for us. We're going to go follow after Jeroboam. And you think that the knee-jerk reaction is, let's get the armies together and let's preserve the union. Let's get up there and preserve the union. But the word of the Lord comes to Jeroboam, and no, don't do that. This thing's from God, so don't do that. And Rehoboam listened, and that was one of the good things that he did. And look, I think this is all part of this first 3 years. Look at 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 17. 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 17. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, for 3 years, for they walked in the way of David and Solomon for 3 years. So during the first 3 years, after, Rehoboam got past this initial kind of bad judgment mistake that we're going to talk about more here in a minute, he did follow in the ways of David and follow in the ways of Solomon for 3 years. Now, isn't that interesting that Solomon is thrown into that again? Just, if you're turned there, look at that verse. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 17. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, for 3 years, for they walked in the way of David and Solomon. Well, we're used to saying they walked in the way of David. David's the standard that they're all compared to. But Solomon here is held up as a standard also. And you've got to think that for that first 20 years of Solomon's 40-year reign, that Solomon was doing things right and following God. It wasn't until after he finished the temple that he started following going after all the foreign wives and following their gods. So Solomon is held up as an example here also, and they were following in their ways. But that's 3 years of a 17-year reign. So for 14 years, he wasn't following after David, and Rehoboam wasn't following after David and after Solomon. And also, when they after those 3 years, and when Rehoboam started not obeying God and not following God with his whole heart, God allowed an adversary to come up and oppress them, and this time it was Egypt. Look at 2 Chronicles 12, verses 2 through 7. I'm going to start with verse 1. When the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Isn't that interesting? We can talk about more of that in a minute also, and the bad things. But it happened when things were going good. How often is that the case? Is there a lesson in there for me and you? When things are going good, that's when they forsook the Lord. And I would propose to you that that's when you and I really need to be examining ourselves also. We think things are going good. We start to get this attitude that, man, I don't need God. Things are going pretty good. Well, that's not the attitude we should have. Things are going good because of God. He deserves the thanks, the praise, the honor, and the glory. But that's what the text tells us. When things were going good and they were strong, that's when they forsook the Lord. It's also interesting to me the usage of the word Israel in chapter 12 and verse 1. This is clearly talking about Rehoboam and the southern 2 tribes. When the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, and he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Well, he's the king of the southern 2 tribes that's normally called Judah. But it's what I was telling you a minute ago. Sometimes Israel can be used as a proxy. Isn't that interesting? Normally we think Israel is referring to the northern kingdom. So verse 2, and it came about in King Rehoboam's 5th year, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord for about 3 years now, or about 2 years now, that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, and the people who came with him from Egypt were without number, and Lubim and Sukkim and the Ethiopians. He captured and fortified the cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. Then Shemaiah, the prophet, came to Rehoboam and the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, you have forsaken me, so I also have forsaken you to Shishak." So the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "You know what? The Lord is righteous." It's as if to say, the Lord is right. We have forsaken him. We can't say anything against that. He's absolutely right. We have forsaken. The Lord is righteous, and he's right about this. When the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah, saying, "They have humbled themselves, so I will not destroy them, but I will grant them some measure of deliverance, and my wrath shall not be poured out in Jerusalem by means of Shishak. But they will become his slaves, so that they will learn the difference between my service and the service of the kingdoms of the countries," which is kind of interesting. They're gonna have to serve Egypt for a while, so they know the difference. They weren't willing to be obedient to me. They're going to have to be obedient to Egypt for a while. But he didn't use Egypt to utterly destroy Jerusalem at this point. Okay, so those are like the 3 things that are good, or that it looks like Rehoboam did the right thing. He humbled himself when he was called on the mat about their disobedience to God during the preceding 2 years. Here, he humbled himself. But we're going to look now at this list of kind of things that Rehoboam did wrong. You see the list is kind of twice as long. We could probably talk about a few other things also. First of all, he went opinion shopping. Now, we know the story, and David read the account for us about how Rehoboam made this very unwise decision and chose to listen to the young counselors instead of the old counselor. And there's a lesson. I mean, this whole class is supposed to be lessons that we can glean from these kings. There's definitely a lesson in there for us. And at a young age, I realized that when somebody older tells me something, I need to really listen to it. I'm not saying we give them carte blanche. I'm not saying I turn my will over to theirs and let them make all decisions for me. But I do approach that with a certain amount of trepidation, that am I about to countermand or go against the advice of somebody older than me who's had more experience? And I take that very seriously, because I don't want to be guilty of this same mistake that Rehoboam made. That's certainly a lesson that we can walk away with from Rehoboam. But I want to talk about this just a little bit more. Look how, this is in 1 Kings 12 and verse 8. 1 Kings, we're going to go to 1 Kings 12 and verse 8. 1 Kings 12 and verse 8. But he forsook the counsel of the elders which they had given him, and they consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. Think about the implications of that for a minute. It's not just the young men, the young counselors. These are guys who grew up with him, number one, and who served him, number two. These are guys, in the corporate world we would call, these are his direct reports, right? These are the guys that report up to him. And having served in the corporate world for a little while, there's a real risk here of knowing what my boss wanted to hear and knowing what he wanted to hear, but knowing that the right answer might be something other than what he wants to hear. And, how much am I really willing to risk that? Well, he learned pretty quick he was going to get, the straight answer from me. I was always keenly aware that I didn't want to be the yes man. I think there's value in that. I think there's value in your boss learning that you're willing to give it to him straight, regardless. You see other people not willing to take that risk, right? Of telling them the hard facts. If you want the truth, if you want some measure of honesty, one of the best things to do is go out and seek somebody who's independent, who doesn't report up directly to you, who isn't your best buddy that you grew up with. There's no independence there. There's no independence. It's just interesting to me that the text gives us those two little details. I think we can learn something from those two details. They were guys he grew up with, these young people, and they already served him. They were already people that reported to him. And I also want you to see at the very start of that verse, verse 8, what it says, but he forsook the counsel of the elders. Okay. He hasn't even heard what the young guys have to say yet. This isn't a matter of, I'm going to go out, I'm going to be wise here, I'm going to get these guys' opinion over here, I'm going to get these guys' opinion over here, I'm going to get my mom's opinion, I'm going to get my wife's opinion, whoever. And then I'm going to try to, have them give me their reasons and see what's best. What I get from this, guys, because it says he forsook the counsel of the older people, is he didn't like their answer, and so he wanted to go to somebody who he figured would give him the answer that he wanted. I call that opinion shopping. He's shopping for the opinion that he already wants. Didn't that strike you? Have you noticed that before? That he makes his mind up to forsake the counsel of the elders before he even goes and hears what the younger have to say? That's opinion shopping. That's not, well, I'm going to go out and kind of pull everybody and maybe somebody will read it. He's opinion shopping at this point. Okay. Those guys he grew up with, they knew what he wanted to hear. They grew up with him, and they told him what he wanted to hear. That's the first thing I think he did wrong. That was, we talk about the mistake that he made, and yeah, I think it can be said he trusted the younger people instead of the older people. That's true. But I want to say it a little differently, and I want you guys to think about it a little bit differently. I think he already had his mind made up by the fact that he forsook the counsel of the older people before he even had the younger people. In other words, I'll check with my counselors because that's the right thing to do, but here's what I really want to do. I'm going to do it. So I'm going to find some counselor who's going to tell me what I want to do. I think that's interesting. The next thing I think, yes, please, thank you.
I was thinking about, you could almost see this as like a different flavor of the same mistake that Solomon made, in the sense of who are you keeping around you, who are you listening to, who's whispering in your ear, because ultimately that's what led Solomon astray.
Good point.
And then Rehoboam looks a little different, but he chooses to listen to people who haven't earned their wisdom and aren't steeped in the counsel of God, and it sends him off on the wrong path as well. You can even contrast it with David, who for the most part keeps really good, solid people around him who will help guide him and is always inquiring with the Lord.
That's a great point, Adam. Thank you very much. Kind of similar in that respect to the mistake that Solomon makes. And again, there's a little bit of a different flavor because it's wives. Nonetheless, who are we surrounding ourselves with? 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter, right? What Ryan talked about last week was 1 Corinthians 15th chapter. What verse am I thinking about? Evil. There you go. Evil company or evil communications corrupt good habits or good morals, depending upon what translation you're reading. Very good. So it does matter who we surround ourselves with, and Rehoboam chose to surround himself with young, inexperienced men who would give him the answer he was looking for. Yes, sir, Jay.
Tied to saying that and Solomon's mistake, it was probably directly related. I wouldn't say probably, but
Yeah.
I mean, were these possibly his brothers? What would be my brothers? What, stepbrothers and that? I mean,
Yeah. All the children that all those wives had.
yeah,
That he grew up with. It says he grew up with them. If we think about, I love your point, Jay. If we think about like somebody growing up in and around the harem, they're probably growing up with the sons and daughters of all his other wives and concubines. It's a very good point. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, I want to read, do a little bit of a reading here. 2 Chronicles 12 verses 1 through 4. We'll start with 2 Chronicles 11, 5 through 12. And I know there's a typo up there. These are both in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles, we're going to start with 11, 5 through 12. Somebody go ahead and read that. 2 Chronicles 11, 5 through 12. Anybody?
Rehoboam lived in Jerusalem, and he built cities for defense in Judah. He built Bethlehem, Edom, Tekoa, Beth-zur, Soko, Adullam, Gath, Mareshah, Ziph, Adorim, Lachish, Azekah, Zorah, Aijalon, and Hebron, fortified cities that are in Judah and in Benjamin. He made the fortresses strong and put commanders in them, and stores of food, oil, and wine. And he put shields and spears in all the cities and made them very strong, so he held Judah and Benjamin.
Thank you for volunteering. There's a lot of, no wonder it was silent. There's a lot of proper nouns in that, a lot of tough names. But here's the point. One of the first things Rehoboam does is, okay, God, I won't, I won't go after Jeroboam. I won't try to reunite the United Kingdom. But you know what I am going to do? I am going to build these fortified cities. What is this a demonstration of? Yes.
I think it's just what we said with Solomon earlier, building up your horses and your
There you go.
They said that gold and silver was like stones. And we even made the comment that Solomon would have probably been a great administrator.
Yeah.
Probably a great civil servant.
Yeah.
But they also have a spiritual requirement as king.
Yeah.
And they're focused too much on the earthly protection of their wealth. I mean, he's storing up all these goods. But through that, you're spending so much time not on other things.
Very good. I appreciate that, Ryan. This is evidence, and I love the reference back to Solomon, or you could even go back to David and talk about him numbering the people. In both those instances we talked about, this is evidence of a king not relying on God, not trusting God's ability to protect them. If we're just faithful to God and we keep doing what he says, do they need to really worry about building fortified cities? God will take care of them. God will fight their battles. But when you start multiplying horses, when you start multiplying chariots, when you start building these fortified cities, to me, it's evidence of somebody who is not willing to have faith that God is going to take care of them the way that he's promised to take care of them. It's evidence of a lack of faith. It's evidence of a lack of faith. God, we need to build these fortified cities because, if somebody comes and attacks us, we don't know if you can handle it. And it's an evidence of a lack of faith, I think. It's kind of like numbering the people, but it's taking it a step further and saying, okay, let's build up these. Now, I want to read what good that did. Remember we were talking about Egypt coming in and attacking them? Look at 2 Chronicles, the next chapter, 2 Chronicles 12, verses 1 through 4. Actually, we're not going to read 1 through 3. We've already read it, but look at verse 4. 2 Chronicles 12, verse 4. He captured, this is Shashik, right? The king, Shishak, excuse me, the king of Egypt. Verse 4, he captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. Here is what relying on yourself or your sword or your great numbers, here's what it does for you. First guy that comes and attacks, Shishak, right? The king of Egypt. He captured these fortified cities. And he pressed his way as far as Jerusalem. And if God hadn't relented, Shishak could have destroyed Jerusalem. But they humbled themselves, and God said, okay, because you've humbled yourself, I won't use Shishak, the king of Egypt, to destroy Jerusalem. But you are going to serve him for a while. You are going to serve him, so you know the difference. So I think it's just such a great lesson. How faithful are we to rely on God? Do we rely on God? Do we trust God that he's going to do what he said he's going to do? What has he promised us? He's promised us eternal life. What has he told us? He said, nothing is as important. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world? Nothing's as important as serving God. It doesn't profit us if we gain the whole world and lose our soul. Okay. Let's see. Opinion shop, he trusted in the sword. Look at the references to him forsaking God. 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 1. When the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Think about that for a minute. Again, we mentioned this a minute ago. Happened when they were strong, happened in good times, and I think there's a lesson in that for us. But also, look at how the example that Rehoboam set the tone for the whole nation. We talked about this last week. As the king goes, sometimes so goes the nation. Okay? King Rehoboam forsook God, and then we have in 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 1 that he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Now, we won't take the time to go back there. We did this last week. But remember Deuteronomy chapter 17. If you want the reference, it's verses 18 and 19. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 18 and 19. One of the things that God tells him is when you have a king, he needs to get a copy of the law and he needs to read it daily. Again, lessons that you and I can take away from the life of Rehoboam. What if Rehoboam had been following this diligently? Reading the law daily. That says something to me and you. And Linda's much better about this than I am. Getting up and knocking out her Bible reading first thing in the morning. And I think that sets the tone for the whole day. I need to be better about that, about creating that habit. I wonder if things would have been different for Rehoboam if he had had that habit, if he had followed Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 and 19, which instructs the king to do exactly that. Read the law daily. But what we're told here in chapter 12 and verse 1 of 2 Chronicles is that he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. I guess what I'm positing is that if you're reading it daily, it might be harder to forsake. All right, we are out of time, and we are going to probably I got so many other things I want to talk about. We're going to bleed over into next week. It's hard to talk about Jeroboam without talking about Rehoboam anyway, so there'll be a little bit of cross-pollination going on there anyway. So we'll talk about some of the other mistakes that Rehoboam made, and we'll talk about some of the big mistakes that Jeroboam made next week. Thank you for your comments and your participation.